The obese girl fought off wolves to rescue the wounded mountain man. I'm not leaving you here. The winter of 1793 descended upon the western frontier of Pennsylvania with a cruelty that old-timers said they hadn't seen in decades. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the Allegheny wilderness, transforming the dense pine forests into a ghostly labyrinth of white and shadow. It was a land where survival depended on strength, cunning, and an iron will, a land that belonged to those brave or foolish enough to claim it. Jacob Mountain. Thorne was neither brave nor foolish. He was simply a man who belonged nowhere else. At 32 years old, he stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an ox yoke and hands that could snap a man's arm like kindling. His face bore the scars of countless fights, a jagged line across his left cheek from a Shawnee tomahawk, a crooked nose broken 3 times, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to see everything and trust nothing. Mountain had earned his name honestly. He'd spent the better part of a decade trapping beaver in the mountain streams, hunting bear in the high country, and trading furs at the frontier posts that dotted the western territories. He knew these woods better than any man alive, could track a deer through a blizzard, and had survived encounters that would have killed lesser men twice over. But on this bitter January night, his luck had finally run out. The ambush had come without warning. Mountain had been tracking a group of outlaws, the Brennan brothers and their gang of cutthroats, who'd been terrorizing settlers along the Monongahela River. The Brennans had a personal grudge against him, dating back 2 years to when Mountain had killed their youngest brother in a fair fight over a disputed trapline. They'd sworn revenge, and tonight they'd gotten it. The rifle shot had cracked through the frozen air like thunder. Mountain had felt the bullet punch into his side just below the ribs, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the snow. He'd managed to fire back, heard a scream that told him he'd hit one of them. But then there were more shots, more shouts, and he'd had no choice but to run. He'd stumbled through the woods for what felt like hours, leaving a trail of blood black against the white snow. His strength had ebbed with each step, until finally his legs had given out beneath a massive old pine tree. He'd collapsed against the trunk, pressing one hand against the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, and knew with grim certainty that he was going to die alone in these woods. The cold was already creeping into his bones, his vision blurred at the edges. He thought about his life, about the parents he'd buried when he was 16, about the countless miles he'd walked alone, about the fact that he'd never let anyone close enough to mourn him when he was gone. And then, impossibly, he heard his name being called through the darkness. "Mountain! Mountain, where are you?" The voice was young, female, and filled with desperate worry. For a moment, Mountain thought he was already dead and hearing angels. But angels didn't sound quite so out of breath, and they certainly didn't curse quite so colorfully when they stumbled over a snow-covered log. Sarah Brenner emerged from the swirling snow like an apparition. She was 18 years old, with a round face flushed red from exertion, brown eyes wide with fear, and a body that society would unkindly call obese. She wore a heavy wool coat that strained at its buttons, a fur cap pulled low over her ears, and boots that were far too large for her hand-me-downs from her father, who died 3 years past. She'd been searching for Mountain for nearly 4 hours, ever since she'd heard the gunshots from her family's cabin 2 miles east. Sarah had known immediately that something was wrong. Mountain had stopped by their cabin that morning, as he did every few weeks when he passed through the territory. He'd shared breakfast with her and her mother, warned them about the Brennan gang operating in the area, and promised to come back through in a few days. Sarah had watched him leave with a feeling she couldn't quite name, a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her labored breathing and everything to do with the way Mountain's rare smile had made her feel like she mattered. Now, seeing him collapsed against the tree, his face pale as death and his coat soaked with blood, Sarah felt that tightness turn to ice-cold terror. "Mountain!" She crashed through the snow to his side, falling to her knees and pulling his head up to rest against her shoulder. His skin was cold, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Oh, God, what did they do to you?" Mountain's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with difficulty. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "I heard the shots. I knew you were in trouble." Her hand shook as she examined his wound, her limited medical knowledge telling her that it was bad, very bad. The bullet had gone clean through, but he'd lost far too much blood. "I followed your trail." "Foolish." Mountain coughed, and Sarah saw blood fleck his lips. "Dangerous. You should go back." "Don't you dare," Sarah said fiercely, tears burning in her eyes. "Don't you dare tell me to leave you here." "Can't move me? Too far gone." Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "Wolves will come. You need to—" As if summoned by his words, a long, haunting howl cut through the night air. Then another, and another. Sarah felt every hair on her body stand on end. She'd heard plenty of wolf howls living on the frontier, but never this close, never this many, and never when she was this far from safety. She looked around wildly and saw them yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, low shapes moving between the trees, a pack, at least 3 of them, maybe more, and they'd smelled blood. Mountain tried to push himself upright, tried to reach for the rifle that lay in the snow a few feet away, but his body wouldn't obey. He was too weak, too far gone. All he could do was watch as the wolves began to circle, moving closer with each pass, their hunger evident in every deliberate step. "Sarah," he managed to say, "run, please. They won't follow you if you leave now." But Sarah wasn't listening, or rather, she was listening to something deeper than his words, listening to the part of herself that had grown stronger over the past 3 years, the part that had learned to survive without her father, to hunt and trap and fight when necessary, to be harder than the world expected a girl like her to be. She'd spent her whole life being told what she couldn't do. Couldn't dance at the harvest festival because she'd look foolish. Couldn't court boys from the settlement because none of them would want a fat girl for a wife. Couldn't be anything more than a burden, a joke, someone to be pitied or scorned. But Mountain had never looked at her like that. From the first time they'd met, when she was 15 and he'd helped her father repair their cabin roof, he'd treated her like a person worth knowing. He'd taught her how to set rabbit snares, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to tell the difference between wolf tracks and dog tracks. He'd never commented on her size, never made her feel like she was anything less than capable. And now he was telling her to leave him to die. Not a chance in hell. Sarah grabbed the thick branch lying near the pine tree, a piece of dead wood as thick as her forearm and nearly 4 feet long. She positioned herself between Mountain and the approaching wolves, planting her feet in the snow and raising the makeshift club with both hands. "Get back!" she shouted at the wolves, her voice cracking with fear but steady with determination. "You're not touching him! You hear me? Not touching him!" The lead wolf, a large gray male with a scarred muzzle, paused. It cocked its head, studying this strange prey that refused to run. The two wolves, flanking it, a smaller female and a rangy younger male, growled low in their throats. Behind Sarah, Mountain watched in disbelief. In all his years on the frontier, he'd seen men freeze in terror at the sight of wolves, seen seasoned hunters turn and run. But here was this girl, this sweet, soft-hearted girl who blushed when he complimented her cooking, standing her ground against predators that could tear her apart. "Sarah, please," he whispered, but she didn't turn around. The lead wolf took another step forward. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, but she held her ground. She'd read once, in one of the precious books her father had owned, that predators respected strength and feared confidence. She didn't feel particularly strong or confident right now, but she'd be damned if she'd let these wolves see her fear. "I said get back!" She swung the branch hard through the air, creating a whooshing sound that made the wolves flinch. "This is your only warning!" The lead wolf snarled, lips pulling back from yellowed fangs. It tensed, preparing to charge. And then it did. The wolf launched itself through the air, aiming straight for Sarah's throat. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah saw every detail with crystal clarity: the wolf's extended claws, its open jaws, the hunger in its eyes. She didn't think. She simply reacted. She swung the branch with every ounce of strength in her body. The solid wood connected with the wolf's skull with a sickening crack that echoed through the forest. The wolf yelped and crashed sideways into the snow, rolling several times before scrambling to its feet, shaking its head in confusion and pain. Sarah didn't give it time to recover. She advanced on the stunned wolf, raising her club again. "That's right. Come at me again. I dare you!" The female wolf tried to circle around behind her. Sarah spun, faster than her size would suggest possible, and jabbed the end of the branch hard into the wolf's ribs. The animal yelped and retreated several paces. "Two down!" Sarah was crying now, tears freezing on her cheeks, but she didn't lower her weapon. "Who's next?" The young male wolf, perhaps less experienced or more desperate than its packmates, decided to try its luck. It darted in low, trying to grab Sarah's leg. She brought the branch down on its back with crushing force. The wolf howled in pain and rage, twisting around to snap at the branch. Its teeth sank deep into the wood, and for a moment there was a terrible tug of war. Sarah pulled hard, trying to wrench her weapon free, but the wolf held on with the desperation of starvation. They struggled back and forth, Sarah's boots slipping in the snow, the wolf growling and thrashing. Then the lead wolf, having recovered from the blow to its head, saw its opportunity. It charged again, this time going for Sarah's exposed side. "Sarah!" Mountain's shout was weak but urgent. Sarah saw the danger from the corner of her eye. She made a split-second decision that probably saved her life. She let go of the branch. The young wolf went tumbling backward, still gripping the wood in its jaws. Sarah threw herself sideways, hitting the snow hard, just as the lead wolf's jaws snapped shut on empty air where her ribs had been a moment before. She rolled, came up on her knees, and grabbed a fistful of snow and frozen pine needles. As the lead wolf turned for another attack, she threw it straight into the animal's eyes. The wolf flinched, shaking its head, and Sarah used that precious second to lunge for Mountain's rifle. Her hands closed around the cold metal. She didn't know if it was loaded, didn't know if the powder was still dry enough to fire, didn't know anything except that she had to try. She hauled the weapon up, pointed it in the general direction of the wolves, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, and the explosion of gunfire shattered the night. The shot went wild. Sarah had never fired a gun in her life, but the noise was enough. The wolves, already unnerved by this prey that refused to die easily, had had enough. The lead wolf gave one final snarl, then turned and bounded away into the darkness. The other two followed, casting backward glances that promised they'd be back if they got the chance. For a long moment, Sarah just knelt there in the snow, the rifle still clutched in her shaking hands, her breath coming in great heaving gasps. Then the adrenaline drained away all at once, leaving her trembling so violently she could barely hold on to the gun. She dropped the rifle and crawled back to Mountain's side. He was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something between awe and disbelief. "You—" He struggled to speak, his voice hoarse. "You fought them off." "I told you," Sarah said, and despite everything, the fear, the cold, the blood, the sheer impossibility of what had just happened, she managed a shaky smile. "I'm not leaving you here." But surviving the wolves was only half the battle. Mountain was still dying, and they were still miles from help, in the middle of a snowstorm, with no guarantee that the wolves wouldn't return. Sarah forced herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her mind. First priority, stop the bleeding. She tore strips from her petticoat, thanking God that her mother had insisted she wear proper undergarments, despite the fact that she was just going into the woods and packed them against Mountain's wound, binding them in place with her scarf. Mountain hissed in pain, but didn't cry out. "Good," he managed. "Tight. Has to be tight." "I know." Sarah's hands were covered in his blood now, sticky and warm even in the freezing air. "I helped Papa dress a wound once. Man got gored by a boar." "Did he survive?" "For 3 days," Sarah said honestly. Then, seeing Mountain's expression, she added quickly, "But he was old, and the wound got infected. You're strong. You'll make it." Mountain wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But he could feel his life leaking away with every heartbeat, could feel the cold seeping into his core. "Sarah, you did incredible thing, but you need to go now. Get help." "Not enough time," Sarah said bluntly. She'd thought about this while binding his wound. "It'd take me 2 hours to get back to the cabin and another 4 to get to the settlement and bring someone back. You'd freeze to death before I made it halfway home." "Then—" Mountain's eyes were starting to glaze over again. "What?" "Then I'm taking you with me." Sarah stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She was exhausted, terrified, and had no idea if what she was about to attempt was even possible. But she'd come this far. She wasn't about to give up now. She positioned herself next to Mountain, got her arms under his shoulders, and pulled with all her might. Mountain was easily twice her size, dead weight, and soaked with snow and blood. For a horrible moment, Sarah thought she couldn't do it, thought her strength would give out, thought she'd have to watch him die in front of her. But then she thought about the way Mountain had smiled at her that morning over breakfast, the way he'd asked her about the book she was reading, genuinely interested in her thoughts, the way he'd never, not once, made her feel like she was anything less than worthy of respect and friendship, and something inside her refused to accept defeat. Sarah gritted her teeth, planted her boots firmly in the snow, and pulled. Mountain moved just an inch, but he moved. She pulled again, another inch, again and again. It was the slowest, most agonizing journey of her life. Every few feet she had to stop and rest, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. The wind picked up, driving snow into her face until she could barely see. Her hands went numb. Her feet went numb. Everything went numb except the determination that kept her moving forward. Mountain faded in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he was aware enough to try to help, using his legs to push weakly against the ground. Other times he was completely limp, murmuring incoherently about things Sarah couldn't understand. Once he called out for someone named Mary, and Sarah felt a strange pang in her chest that she recognized distantly as jealousy. The wolves followed them. Sarah could hear them in the darkness, could see their eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the storm. They were waiting, patient, knowing that eventually this stubborn prey would tire and fall. But Sarah kept the rifle close, and every time the wolves got too near, she'd stop dragging Mountain long enough to fire a shot in their direction. She only had 3 more bullets, but the wolves didn't know that. Time lost all meaning. Sarah fell twice, landing hard on the frozen ground, and each time she wanted nothing more than to just lie there and rest. But each time she thought of Mountain dying alone in the snow, and she forced herself back to her feet. She talked to him constantly, partly to keep him awake and partly to keep herself going. She told him about the farm she and her mother were trying to keep running, about the chickens they'd raised from chicks, about the garden that had produced surprisingly well last summer, about her dreams of maybe someday opening a small trading post where travelers could buy supplies and hear the latest news. "You'll help me, won't you?" she panted, dragging him over a particularly stubborn fallen log. "When you're better. You know everyone. You could bring in customers." Mountain's response was barely audible. "Yes, anything." "Promise?" Sarah didn't know why it was suddenly important to hear him say it, but it was. "Promise?" Mountain's hand moved weakly, finding hers and squeezing with what little strength he had left. "Promise, Sarah." That small gesture gave Sarah the strength to keep going. When she finally saw the dim glow of lamplight through the trees, Sarah actually sobbed with relief. Her mother's cabin. They'd made it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd made it. She half-dragged, half-carried Mountain the last 100 yards and was nearly at the door when it burst open. Her mother, Mary Brenner, stood there with a rifle raised, then immediately lowered it when she saw Sarah. "Dear God!" Mary rushed out into the snow. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-40s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude forged by years of frontier survival. "Sarah, what happened?" "The Brennan gang," Sarah gasped out. "Shot Mountain. I found him. Wolves came. I fought them off. I brought him here." Mary's eyes widened as she took in her daughter covered in blood and snow, trembling with exhaustion, but very much alive. Then she saw Mountain and switched immediately into crisis mode. "Get him inside, quickly. We'll talk after." Together, they carried Mountain into the cabin and laid him on the bed. Mary immediately set to work, years of frontier doctoring experience taking over. She examined the wound, cleaned it with precious whiskey, probed it for any remaining bullet fragments, and sewed it shut with practiced efficiency, while Mountain blessedly remained unconscious. Sarah collapsed into a chair by the fire, watching her mother work. She was too tired to even take off her wet coat. Her hands were still shaking. She couldn't quite believe any of what had just happened was real. When Mary finally finished bandaging Mountain and covered him with their heaviest quilt, she turned to her daughter. For a long moment, she just looked at Sarah, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Then she crossed the room and pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. "You saved his life," Mary whispered. "My brave, brave girl, you saved his life." And Sarah, who'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will for the past 6 hours, finally allowed herself to fall apart. She cried into her mother's shoulder, great, heaving sobs that shook her whole body, and her mother held her tight, murmuring words of comfort and pride. Mountain woke 3 days later. The first thing he became aware of was warmth. Not the fleeting, false warmth of freezing to death, but real warmth from a crackling fire. The second thing he noticed was that he wasn't dead. Given how he'd felt in the woods, that came as something of a surprise. He opened his eyes slowly, wincing at even the dim lamplight. He was in a small cabin, lying in a bed that smelled of lavender and fresh straw. The ceiling was low, supported by rough-hewn beams. He could hear the wind howling outside, but inside it was blessedly warm. "Easy," Sarah's voice came from somewhere to his left. "Don't try to sit up yet. You'll tear your stitches." Mountain turned his head. Even that small movement sent pain lancing through his side, and saw her sitting in a chair beside the bed. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy braid, but she was smiling. "Sarah," he croaked. His throat was dry as desert sand. "You're real, not a fever dream." "Very real." She stood and fetched a cup of water, helping him drink with surprising gentleness for someone who'd so recently been beating wolves with a stick. "You've been out for 3 days. Ma says you were touch and go for the first 48 hours, but your fever broke yesterday. She thinks you'll pull through now." Mountain's mind was fuzzy, memories jumbled and unclear, but certain images stood out with crystal clarity. Sarah standing over him, club raised, defying the wolves. Sarah dragging him through the snow. Sarah promising she wouldn't leave him. "You saved my life," he said. Sarah blushed and looked away. "You'd have done the same for me." "Not sure I could have fought off 3 wolves. 4, actually. There was a 4th one that came later, but it ran off when I threw a rock at it." Sarah said this matter-of-factly, as if throwing rocks at wolves was just another daily chore. "How are you feeling? Are you in pain? Ma left some willow bark tea if you need it." "I'm fine," Mountain lied. In truth, he felt like he'd been trampled by a horse, shot, and left to freeze, which wasn't far from the truth. But more than the physical pain, he was grappling with a realization that was slowly dawning on him. This girl, this woman, had risked everything to save him, had fought off predators, had dragged him miles through a blizzard, had refused to abandon him even when it would have been the sensible thing to do. No one had ever done that for him before. No one had ever cared enough. "Sarah," he said slowly, "why did you come looking for me? You could have died out there. You should have—" "Should have what? Let you die alone?" Sarah's voice was sharper than he'd ever heard it. "Let the wolves have you? Mountain, you're important. To Ma and me. You're our friend, our family almost. Did you really think we'd just let you disappear into the woods and not try to find you?" "I didn't think anyone would notice," Mountain admitted quietly. Sarah stared at him, then shook her head in disbelief. "You absolute fool. Do you have any idea how many times you saved our lives? You brought us food that first winter after Pa died. You scared off the men who tried to claim our land. You taught me how to survive out here, and you think we wouldn't notice if you died?" She was crying now, tears running down her face, and Mountain felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been frozen and locked away for longer than he could remember. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't realize. I didn't know." "Didn't know what? That people care about you?" Sarah wiped angrily at her tears. "Well, they do. I do. And if you ever scare me like that again, I swear I'll shoot you myself." Despite everything, Mountain smiled. It hurt. His face hurt everything, really, but he couldn't help it. Noted. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Finally, Mountain said, "Tell me again. How you found me, how you fought them off, all of it." So Sarah did. She told him about hearing the shots, about tracking him through the storm, about finding him half dead under the pine tree. She told him about the wolves, about the fear that had turned to fury, about the desperate fight and the even more desperate journey back to the cabin. Mountain listened to every word, watching her face as she spoke. He saw the way her eyes lit up when she described fighting off the wolves, saw the pride mixed with lingering fear. He saw strength he'd never fully appreciated before, courage he'd never thought to look for. And he saw, really saw, that Sarah Brenner was not just the girl who made good stew and laughed at his jokes. She was a warrior. She was someone who'd faced death without flinching. She was someone worth knowing, worth admiring, worth loving. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and he must have made a sound because Sarah immediately leaned forward, concerned. "Are you all right? Should I get Ma?" "No," Mountain said quickly. "No, I'm fine, just thinking." "About what?" Mountain looked at her, really looked at her, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "About how wrong I've been." "Wrong about what?" "About everything," he said softly. "About being alone, about not needing anyone, about—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. What did he have to lose? He'd already nearly died once this week. "About you?" Sarah went very still. "Me? I've spent my whole life thinking I was better off on my own," Mountain said, "thinking that needing people was weakness. But you showed me I was wrong. You showed me that strength isn't about being alone, it's about having someone worth fighting for, someone worth coming back to." "Mountain." "Let me finish," he said gently. "Please. I don't know if I'll have the courage to say this again." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Mountain continued. "You're kind and smart, and you see people really see them in a way most folks don't. You saw something in me worth saving, even when I didn't see it myself. And He took a shaky breath. "I'd like to think there might be something in me worth loving. Someday, if you'd give me the chance to prove it." The cabin was silent, except for the fire and the wind. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Mountain could hear it. She thought about all the times she'd watched him ride away from their cabin, wishing he'd stay. All the times she'd caught herself watching for his return, making excuses to herself about why it mattered. All the times she'd lain awake at night, thinking about a future that seemed impossible. "You don't have to prove anything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're already worth loving, Mountain. You always have been." This time, when Mountain smiled, it reached his eyes, and Sarah thought she'd never seen anything more beautiful. The snow finally melted in late March, turning the forest floor into a carpet of wildflowers and new grass. Mountain's wound had healed to a thick pink scar that pulled when he moved too quickly. But Mary Brenner's doctoring had been sound, and he'd regained most of his strength. He'd stayed at the Brenner cabin throughout the winter, partly because traveling would have been impossible, and partly because he simply didn't want to leave. He and Sarah had spent the long winter months talking by the fire about everything and nothing, about their pasts and their hopes for the future, about books and hunting and the state of the territories. They'd also spent those months falling deeper in love, though it took Mountain until February to work up the courage to actually kiss her. When he did tentatively, terrified of scaring her away, Sarah had laughed against his lips and pulled him closer, whispering that she'd been wondering when he'd finally get around to it. Now it was spring, and Mountain sat on the porch of the Brenner cabin, whittling a piece of wood and watching Sarah tend her garden. She moved between the neat rows of planted seeds, her face turned up to the sun, humming a tune he didn't recognize. She looked happy, content. She looked like home. "You planning to marry her or just sit there mooning?" Mary's voice came from the doorway behind him. Mountain didn't turn around, but he smiled. He and Mary had come to an understanding over the winter. She'd made it clear that if he hurt her daughter, she'd shoot him herself, and Mountain believed her. He'd also made it clear that he had no intention of hurting Sarah ever, which seemed to satisfy Mary for the time being. "Planning too," Mountain admitted, "just waiting for the right moment." "The right moment?" Mary snorted. "Son, she fought off wolves for you. I'm pretty sure she's not going to turn down a proposal. Besides, if you wait much longer, folks will start talking. A man living in a cabin all winter with 2 women? Even out here, tongues wag." Mountain had thought about that, had thought about a lot of things, actually. "I want to do it proper," he said. "Want to have something to offer her, more than just me." Mary was quiet for a moment. Then she came out onto the porch and sat down in the chair next to him. "You know what Sarah wants more than anything?" she asked. "What?" "A trading post. A place where travelers can stop, get news, buy supplies. She's talked about it for years." Mary looked out at her daughter in the garden. "But she'll never do it on her own. Wouldn't feel right, leaving me alone here. And we don't have the capital to start something like that anyway." Mountain thought about this. He thought about the money he'd saved over years of trapping money that sat in a strong box in a bank in Pittsburgh because he'd never had anything worth spending it on. He thought about the way Sarah's face lit up when she talked about her dream. And he thought about the fact that he'd spent his whole life wandering, never putting down roots, because he'd never had a reason to stay in one place. Until now. "What if," he said slowly, "we built it together, the 3 of us? A trading post, maybe here or maybe closer to the new road they're talking about building. Sarah could run the store. I could bring in furs and news from the territories. You could manage the books and keep us all from going bankrupt." Mary raised her eyebrows. "You give up trapping? Living in the wilderness?" "Not give up entirely," Mountain said, "but scale back. Spend more time here than out there." He looked at Mary steadily. If it meant building a life with your daughter, yes, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Mary studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she smiled. "You've got my blessing," she said. "Not that you probably needed it, but you have it. Now go ask her before I die of old age waiting." Mountain laughed, stood up, and walked down into the garden where Sarah was planting what she'd told him were beans. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, shading her eyes against the sun. "Hey," she said, smiling, "come to help or just to supervise?" "Neither," Mountain said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something he'd been working on for the past month, a ring he'd carved from a piece of white oak, polished smooth and inlaid with tiny pieces of copper he'd shaped into the pattern of pine trees. Sarah's eyes widened. "Mountain, I know I'm not much," he said quickly before he lost his nerve. "I know I don't have a fancy house or a good name or any of the things a woman like you deserves, but I have money saved, and I have 2 hands willing to work, and I have a heart that's yours if you'll have it. Sarah Brenner, would you—" "Yes," Sarah interrupted. She was crying and laughing at the same time, dirt-stained hands reaching for his. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. You ridiculous man, did you really think I'd say anything else?" Mountain slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Of course it did. He'd measured her finger while she slept carefully over a dozen nights to make sure he got it right. "I want to build the trading post with you," he said. "I want to build a life with you. I want—" Sarah stopped his words with a kiss, there in the garden with the spring sun warm on their faces and the smell of fresh earth all around them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "I want all of that, too," she whispered. "I want everything, as long as it's with you." From the porch, Mary Brenner watched them and smiled, thinking about second chances and unlikely heroes and the strange ways that love could bloom even in the harshest of winters.